Hi, good morning, everybody. As our moderator had introduced, my name is Cristina Bacalso. I'm a researcher. I would consider myself an applied researcher, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. I'm not coming from academia. I'm actually coming from supporting and advising organizations such as yours, people working on the ground in policymaking, but also in designing programs about this topic of participation. I am indeed living in Germany, but I'm originally from Canada. I've been living in Europe for over 15 years, and I have to say I would accredit my life chances to Erasmus because I came to Europe as an Erasmus Mundus fellow. So that started my journey. I am not yet a European citizen. I am not sure if I feel European, but I am always wondering. I wonder if one day it will come to me, but I'm happy to provide maybe an insider and outsider perspective then on Erasmus Plus and this beautiful initiative and what we're all trying to do here today. So let us begin. So just a bit about who I am. So like I mentioned, I'm a researcher, and I actually come from the field of youth. So of course, as you know, Erasmus Plus is youth and education and training, and I really love the opportunity to be able to speak actually to a crowd which is not my typical crowd. Coming from the youth sector, I'm often speaking to youth organizations and others who work in ministries of youth. And so speaking to an education crowd, I think, is really a delight because I think you will give me additional perspective, and I'm hoping that I can also lend you some perspective from the youth angle. And my focus is participation. So relating to youth specifically, but also more broadly, what do we think about participation when we think about democracies, about what it's like to live in Europe today? And my specialization is really in adolescence, youth policies, and human rights. So I have also taken more of what we would call a rights-based perspective in terms of looking at participation as a fundamental human right, and I'll come back to that. I have more than about 20 years in the sector. I would say that that really started when I myself was a young person, really active in campus politics and student activism and student movements. And over the years, that became a research focus of mine. And I was very lucky to turn that experience into something that I find very fascinating. And in my current work as an independent research consultant, I support UN agencies, in particular the UN Agency for Children, UNICEF, working on adolescent development and participation. I also work together with the European Commission and the Council of Europe and various INGOs and governments. And specifically for relevance for all of us today too, I work very closely with Salto Participation and Information, specifically supporting their strategy review and development. So I was tasked here today with this theme, participation in the 21st century. And what I wanted to do is first to really break down the two kind of components of what we are talking about, participation and then the 21st century. So I'll start with the first part, participation. I think it's really important for us to establish a kind of basis in terms of what we are talking about when we use this term participation. It's an everyday term. We use it all the time. And often when we use it, we are talking about to take part, right? So in everyday language, we say, my students participate in class. We had 27 people participate in our program. I participated in that football game. But it's important for us to remember that when we are talking about participation in a democracy, we are really specifically talking about the ability to have a say in and shape the decisions that impact your life. And so fundamentally, we are talking about two things. We are talking about a decision that's being made, and we are talking about the ability to shape that decision, to have an influence on that decision. And so at the individual level, we're talking about autonomy, we're talking about agency, we're talking about self-determination, but of course, it's not simply about your own life. When we live in a democracy, when we live in a society, we're talking about the ability to also shape your community and the world around you. And so while we here in this room working on participation might find it self-evident that participation is important, it can sometimes be helpful to remind ourselves of some of the different rationales. So we had Marita in the beginning starting out with talking about some of these rationales, as well as Dr. Blocker. And I'm just going to present a slightly different way of looking at these different rationales for why participation might be important, particularly to the individual who we're trying to support in engaging in participation. First of all, it's a right. I think that we sometimes forget that participation is actually built into our fundamental civil and political rights. It's related to our freedom to expression, our freedom of association, our freedom to access information. And at the young person level, in particular young people, this right is actually enshrined in international human rights law. We have something called the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and in that convention, Article 12, we have the right to be heard, which is the idea that young people should be able to express their views on matters that affect them, and for those views to be given due weight. Now, this UN convention is the most widely ratified human rights convention in the world. So we have a moral and an ethical, as well as a legal imperative for those of us working in public institutions to try to enshrine this right, to try to respect this right. And while the convention itself, strictly speaking, applies to young people under 18, legal scholars, of course, will emphasize that, I think it does still set an expectation for those of us who work in this field that actually for all people, for all citizens, irrespective of their age, that it is important for them to have the right to be heard. The second rationale for why participation is important is because it empowers. It lifts up the voices of those who themselves do not have the power to make decisions. For example, if you're not a policymaker, if you're not rich, if you're not in the halls of power, you're often left out from those decision-making processes. And so it's about shifting power, which is what Marita had mentioned before. It's about sharing power between the person who makes the decisions and the person who that decision is about. Third, it builds skills and capacities. Participation is an action, it's a practice, and so engaging in participatory processes and participatory work, you're going to be forming opinions, you'll be expressing views, you're going to use communication, you're going to practice dialogue, you're going to engage in debate. And being able to do all those things are also going to be able to develop your self-worth, your self-efficacy. Can you imagine if you were a young person? I'm sure actually you can imagine, we were all young people once before. But to think about the first time when somebody genuinely asked you what you thought, and they listened to you, and what you thought then shaped what the decision was. And I think that this ability of self-efficacy, of the idea that what you think actually can matter, goes a huge way in terms of building individual skills and capacities. And then lastly, which is much more of maybe at an institutional level, it promotes transparency, efficiency, and trust. And again, Marita had mentioned this a little bit before. Think about your educational institution and think about the target group that you work with. If you involve them, for example, in program design, if you ask them, what are your needs? What would make this program attractive to you? And then you take their inputs and build that into how you design your program, you are very likely going to have a more efficient and effective program. You're going to have higher retention. You're going to have participants, learners in that program who feel as if they have some ownership over that program. And ultimately, this is going to build trust in that institution. They're going to feel as if that school, that educational institution really exists for them, has their best interests in mind. And so in the long run, this also helps what we can think of as maybe good governance. This helps to build the trust in institutions, in public services, when we're talking about participation, particularly in education. Now, if you're not too tired of Menti, this is a different Menti. I would like you to scan this or go to menti.com and enter the 8-letter code at the bottom there. And I'd like to ask you a question. So I will have the tech people switch the oh, sorry. Did everyone get a chance to? Okay, sorry. Let's go back. Thank you. We'll wait a moment. I will also write down the number in case we lose it. 250435704. Super. Is everybody in there? I see still some people scanning. No problem. We'll wait. Is it not working? If you go to menti.com, then you can enter these 8 numbers at the bottom. 25043574. Okay, super. Let's switch to the Menti presentation. So what I would like to ask, and then I'm actually going to get you to discuss in your groups, buzz tables, and we'll do that for a few minutes. I would like to ask, again, thinking about our definition of participation, the ability to have a say and shape the decisions that impact you, I would like you to think about your institution. How much influence do learners or whatever target group you have or whatever you would call them, how much influence do they have in the decisions that are made there? There's no right or wrong answers. I'm just curious in terms of how far along are we in terms of really promoting this practice? So please vote so we can get a temperature of the room. And then also I'd like to give you a few minutes just to talk in your tables about this idea of how much influence your target group has. So go ahead, you have a few minutes. So maybe just 2 more minutes, and then I'd like to get some feedback from the crowd. 2 more minutes.
Help you somehow, or just if you need a hand, just like because I'm
Yeah.
also blending into the process. Yeah.
That's perfect, thank you. Okay, super. So I'd like to hear maybe from some of the tables. We have an average here of 2.6. This is actually a very average room out of 5. We're almost right in the middle. And so what I'd like to find out is, can we have some feedback from some people who are below average? Can we have some feedback? Some brave people in the room who would like to reflect on being below average. I'll come over here. Super, this is from adult education. Thank you.
Indeed, from adult education, just a little below average, because where I work, we work with adults with very low literacy skills. And a lot of them come from countries in which they were not allowed to participate. And it's very, very difficult to, because first we need to say it's okay, you can participate, you can give your opinion. So the combination of low literacy skills and that aspect is we want to have a higher level of participation, and we are working on it, but it's a very, very long way with little steps,
Super, thank you. I think we're already hearing about how inclusion also plays a lot into this, the diverse groups that we work with and the different skills that are maybe required and supports. Would someone else who is less than average like to share a bit about their institution? Any brave souls? A moment of reflection. I would have to say in my school growing up, I don't think that I would have rated it as this. I mean, that was in the 80s and 90s. Perhaps things have changed. Who would like to share maybe above? Who would say that they are above the average in terms of influence that learners have at their education institute? At this side again. And we have from schools. Great.
Yeah, my name is Stefan. I'm from Denmark. I'm a high school teacher, and we don't have a central curriculum. The teachers within certain broad documents are able to decide along with their students, and the students have a lot of influence if they take it. They don't always, but they always get asked, and it differs from topic to topic, of course.
Great, thank you. I learned recently the concept of negotiated curriculum as also being a type of approach or a method in terms of involving young people in their educational decisions. Super, so I'll go back to the presentation and we'll mute this mic once more. So I wanted to switch for a moment to talking about Erasmus Plus projects. So we had Yannis talk briefly about the different types of projects that we can see in the participation priority. And in our priority, participation in democratic life, of course, as a horizontal cross-cutting priority, we have this also in youth. And myself and a few other researchers, we did a very brief scan in terms of a review of Erasmus Plus projects in the field of youth that try to integrate this priority, and we came up with 4 rough categories. Maybe we can think of them as entry points into the different ways that projects, at least in the field of youth, try to integrate participation. Now, these categories are not mutually exclusive. You can see different elements of these in various projects, but we think that they kind of come down to 4 different ways. The first are Erasmus Plus projects that develop knowledge and competencies in relation to democracy and participation. We can think of this as maybe participation as a theme. This would be training programs on how democracy processes work. It could also be courses about media literacy or even other types of misinformation type of courses. And so this is really taking the learning and focusing on what participants can learn about democracy and democratic processes. The second type of entry point, the second type of project that we saw, are those projects that really enable participants to influence decision-making in the project itself. So thinking back to that example that I gave about the educational institution, your educational institution, and involving your participants, your learners, to shape the design of a program, this would be an example of that. That would be bringing the participants into the implementation, the design, the evaluation of a project, and having them have a say in the different moments of decision-making within that. And this we can think of as democracy as a practice. We're really letting in the target group into the way that we are making decisions. The third way is enabling participants to influence decisions in the democratic world. So hopefully we are all living in democracies of varying degrees. And this is about bringing our target group, our learners, closer to those processes that exist out in our society. That would be about encouraging learners to go out and vote. That could be bringing in members of parliaments to our schools to give talks on their political platforms or the way that the legislature works. But it's also beyond formal political processes. It could also be about, for example, working with campus activists in terms of how to design an effective advocacy strategy, or maybe even working with some protesters and providing them safety information on how to keep safe and secure in a protest. So it's all about wanting to shape and influence those democratic processes which exist out in the world, and we see projects that are focused on that. And then last, it's about enabling participants to volunteer. It's about their time and their active contribution. I've heard this in VET, for example, about maybe including service learning as part of their mobility, where they would also be visiting an NGO or spending time in a community initiative. In addition to their education experience, they would also do something relating back to that community. And here it's still about shaping decisions, but rather shaping and building the world you want to live in. You can think about it this way. It's another type of participation where you participating in the community service and the community initiatives are also building a type of community that you would like to see. So coming back to our theme, we've talked a bit about participation. Now I want to zoom out a bit more about this very broad concept of the 21st century. I think that the 21st century, what characterizes it? You know, we are a quarter of the way through. We are at 2025. What have we seen so far? It has been a turbulent 25 years. This, I have to admit, is a Wikipedia entry. I think it's very hard to sum up what has happened in 25 years in just a few bullet points, but I will try. And among many, many other things, and I don't mean to diminish or gloss over some other very large events which happened, but of course, we know that we have seen a rapidly increasing rise in global economy. We are a much more globalized world in all respects since the turn of the century. We have seen tremendous political and social and economic shifts and upheavals. We started the century with 9/11. I was in my first year of university in 2001. We then saw Arab Spring as well as various other revolutions and uprisings around the world. We had the global financial crisis crash in 2008, which still reverberates till today, particularly when we think about our young learners growing up in that moment. We had COVID-19, of course, and today we have Ukraine, we have Gaza. And in the backdrop of all of these tremendous changes, we have had an exponential technological and digital change. And of course, that's what we're all here to be discussing. What does this mean for participation? What does this mean for democracy? So I am not a technological expert. So I went to seek out what technological experts are saying about democracy and our digital age. And in 2019, which in technological terms I have to say feels ancient, reading back such a study from 6 years ago, but still I found all of its points very relevant. Pew Research Center in the United States, together with Elon University, reached out to 979 technology experts, researchers, policy leaders, and activists to ask them the following question. Between now, which at that time was 2019, and 2030, how will the use of technology by citizens, civil society groups, and governments affect core aspects of democracy and democratic representation? Now, these were their responses, and Pew grouped them into a handful of fundamental concerns. The first is what they call empowering the powerful. Respondents said that corporate and government agendas generally do not serve democratic goals and outcomes, instead serving the goals of those in power. We can think about the fact that simply a few big corporations control our entire digital lives. And users, us as citizens, as people who are using these digital tools every single day, have virtually no say in how they operate. The next concern they call diminishing the governed. This is fundamentally about a concept called surveillance capitalism. And there's a book by Susanna Zuboff, which has come out, which I haven't read, but I think is really compelling because this is now this new or somewhat new phenomena of our digital lives being scraped, being monitored, data being collected about how we operate online, to then be packaged and sold to corporations to be able to predict our next future behavior, and also potentially to modify our future behavior. And this can be to sell products, right, to better anticipate what we might want to buy next. But of course, this can also be used, has also been used to shape political beliefs, to shape political behaviors. The idea is called surveillance capitalism. Third, exploiting digital illiteracy. So while we can think that the generation right now that is young are digital natives, we can think of all of us as being very embedded in digital worlds, there is still a great amount of digital illiteracy, a lack of digital fluency that exists in our population as a whole. And if you combine this with a general apathy towards politics, we see that we unfortunately are having an ill-informed and fairly dispassionate public, which weakens democracy and fundamentally the fabric of our societies. Waging info wars is about technology that is weaponized to target vulnerable populations and to engineer elections. We have heard from many major elections in the last few years about potential foreign interference. But of course, we can't discount that even our own domestic leaders, our own domestic parties, also can sometimes use technology in a similar way to sway public opinion and potentially to win elections. Sowing confusion. This is about tech-born reality distortion. This is about the inability to see online and be able to tell the difference between what is true, what is false. It is accelerated by AI. And Dr. Blocker had mentioned the concept of AI slop. And for those of you who don't know what AI slop is, it's the generation of almost virtual, nonsensical images and stories and content from AI that make absolutely no sense, but is really flooding all of our media and everything online today. And this really challenges the already shaky public trust that we have in institutions of democracy in terms of where we would go to find our news, or even in terms of if a particular politician actually did what he said he did. And when we're confronted with deep fakes, with certain types of AI-generated imagery where it's difficult for us to see if that is real or not, it distorts our sense of reality. And this makes it difficult for us then to keep politicians accountable and for us to be able to participate in democracy. And then lastly, the last concern that this group had mentioned is about weakening journalism, which is very much linked as well to sowing confusion. But this is really about online tribalism. It's about the idea that we have also built online echo chambers of highly ideological and highly partisan information circles where we simply don't get confronted anymore with ideas that perhaps are contrary to ours. We don't interact with people anymore online who think differently from us. And when you pair this with an already strained and under-resourced journalism field, we have it very difficult for citizens to stay informed in an objective way and for them to be able to remain critical, the things that we need to be able to participate in a functioning democracy. And of course, we see examples of this every day. We do not have to look far. We do not even have to look beyond our own borders to see in the various ways in which our digital era is posing challenges for our democracy in Europe and also abroad. So I'd like you to go back to Menti. And my question in Menti is really to just understand what worries you most about democracy in the digital age. It's a word cloud, so feel free to put one word or a short phrase. But I'm curious if those of you in education, those of you who are really on the front lines of teaching, of supporting skill development in Europe for our young people, but also for adults, adult learners as well too, if it's the same things that scare you that do these technologists that were surveyed a few years ago by Pew. Great. Dead internet. This is really fascinating. Fake news, misinformation, disinformation. Yes. Fake news is a very big one we see here. Algorithms. Yes. We have so much of our content simply curated by an unknowable black box of algorithms. And so perhaps I might Google something, you might Google something, and our results will be entirely different based on our own habits online. Deepfakes, yes. I think deepfakes are going to pose one of our most critical challenges coming up in the future. I think about simply maybe just 5 years ago, perhaps not even 5 years ago, we were hardly speaking about AI. And I think today there's not a single news story or not a single moment online where you are not confronted by something with AI or some news story about AI. And so it's moving incredibly fast. Radicalization, yes, this is a very big one as well too. And this, I think, plays a lot in the youth sector. We talk a lot about radicalization and what to do about that. And this, of course, comes back to EU values. Propaganda, yep. Great. Indifference, certainly. I think that there is also something about the fact that many of us spend so much of our time online that we're losing some of that human connection of being in person and in community with each other, and that certainly can relate, that can feed into something like indifference. Great, thank you. Digital literacy, great. So we'll go back to the presentation. My clicker, there we go. Okay. So returning back to our theme and putting it all together, participation in the 21st century. We talked about what participation is, we talked about why it's important, what it can look like for Erasmus+. Then we zoomed out for a moment and we talked about what does a 21st century look like. We did the doom scenarios, which Dr. Blocker had also introduced us to. And while I think we alone cannot battle big tech, obviously, and we cannot really slow the rapid technological changes ahead of us, I think for us in this room, as educators, as those of us working in Erasmus+, perhaps our contribution to this era, to this phenomena that we're seeing, our contribution to participation and to democracy is actually going to be about skills. And specifically a group of skills called 21st century skills. Now again, I'm not the educator, and I would really be glad to hear from some of you who are the experts on this. But I find it really interesting, this kind of concept of 21st century skills, that actually we need a certain new type of skills to be able to keep up with the environment that we're finding ourselves in. Now, this concept was originally founded by the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, which was a group in the United States, but then was subsequently picked up in various iterations from the World Economic Forum, also the World Health Organization, OECD. And the idea is that there are certain skills which are necessary to be able to live and ideally to thrive in a rapidly evolving, technologically mediated world. Now, of course, we have the foundational skills, which I'm sure all of you are experts in knowing about, the core skills that actually used to be required for work and life before our jobs, our tasks, our interactions became much more complex this century. And again, chiefly due to technology. And so now to be able to survive in this century, again to thrive, there was this idea that learners also need additional skills. The center ones are competencies, which they also call the 4 C's: critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, communication, collaboration. And in addition to these skills, they also identify something called character qualities, which I think is maybe even more difficult to try to comprehend. How do we instill such character qualities? Curiosity, initiative, persistence, grit, adaptability, leadership, social and cultural awareness. Now, coming from the field of youth, and also coming from a background in researching youth work, these skills, these 21st century skills, actually remind me a lot of another set of skills that I'm much more familiar with. And that would be the skills and competencies for democratic culture. And this framework is from the Council of Europe. And I know we have a colleague here from Council of Europe who maybe might point to some of these skills in his next presentation. But this is about the skills and the competencies needed to prepare students for lives as active citizens in democratic societies. And for me, I found that many of them overlap, actually, with what we think about the skills that are needed to survive in a digital century. We have critical thinking and analytical thinking, collaboration, cooperation, conflict resolution. We have creativity, curiosity, adaptability, flexibility. We also, in both senses, have cultural and social awareness, openness to cultural otherness. And so, fundamentally, the 21st century skills, what we're going to need to thrive and survive in this digital age, are also what we're going to need to build democratic resilience. 21st century skills are also skills for democratic culture. I think that they reinforce each other. And so this is my last mentee, and I'd also like to give you a moment to really think about this. Which skills, competencies, and attitudes do you think are the most important for democracy in the digital age? Now, of course, you'll see a ranking, and I'm sure that all of you will say they are all important, but I would be so curious from your educator's perspective to be able to tell me, if you had to rank them, which ones do you think are the most important, given now knowing about the challenges that are facing us in this digital century? So when you're ready, we'll flip to the Menti result screen. Super. We're seeing critical thinking coming up first. Collaboration, cooperation, conflict resolution. In second, yes. But now communication is coming up. Very interesting. Of course, it's difficult to collaborate and cooperate without being able to have those fundamental communication skills. Curiosity and creativity, perhaps still at the end. Adaptability, flexibility, again, an important one, but perhaps not as important as the top. Critical thinking, we're feeling, is maybe the one that we're missing the most. Very interesting. Again, they don't necessarily have a ranking, but I'm curious, for those of you designing projects, designing curriculums, designing programs in terms of how these will feature into the way that you will approach democratic education, for example, like we had heard about this morning, or other types of Erasmus Plus projects. Super. So we'll go back to my presentation, and I just have a few closing slides, and then I'll take the last 10 minutes for conversation, which would be great. So I'd like us to come back to Erasmus Plus, because this is why we're all here. And I want us to think, how can Erasmus Plus help us in this? How can Erasmus Plus help us confront the challenges of this digital era and promote participation and democracy? Well, I think that, I think that this is actually, I went ahead before going to Erasmus+. I think participation in the digital century needs analog skills. I think that this is very important. I think that challenges to democracy in the digital world are a symptom, simply, of challenges to democracy as a whole. Digital technologies, they mediate and they exacerbate these existing challenges that we have. But the fact that we lack a critical citizenry, the fact that we have many people who don't trust in our institutions, that happens regardless of if we have digital or not. It's just that online, our digital lives make those things worse. They magnify those impacts. And what then is important is that we need to think about 21st century skills that can be cultivated offline in everyday engagement in democratic life. And there's never going to be an easy digital fix to it. We need to think about engaging with the individual in the way that they engage with democracy on the ground. So now finally coming back to how Erasmus Plus can help us address this. I think it's about bringing together closer 21st century skills and skills for a democratic culture. It's about thinking about our educational places as places where we can support democracy, not simply just attain skills for work and for general life, but also a place where we can learn how to be active citizens. And in Erasmus Plus specifically, I think it's about working and potentially thinking cross-sectorally. And of course, I think I would say this because I'm coming from youth. I would be pleased to be able to work more with education colleagues to be able to achieve this. And I think it's because each of our sectors actually has strengths and challenges that potentially are complementary to each other. In education and training, for example, you all have a captive audience. You have learners and students who are in your schools, in your educational institutions. And so you are able to reach mass populations. But formal education is traditionally hierarchical, and so I can understand how it can be difficult to try to integrate participation, particularly as a practice, in our typical ways of doing things in education. On the other hand, in the sector of youth, we have youth work and non-formal education, which by design is non-hierarchical, is more collaborative, but we struggle with scale. We're not really reaching as many young people in particular as we think that we could be. And I think that we have to remember that participation, we need to engage with it more than just a theme. It's not just learning about what participation is and what democracy is. We need to be able to embed participation as a practice. We have to live democracy. And this is about lessening hierarchies, emphasizing lived experience of being heard. And again, to most of us in our own lives do not have experience of this, of being heard. We can even think in our own workplaces, in our schools, in our families, it is not very typical that these are spaces for participation. But perhaps this is the moment for us to rethink that. We need to create intentionally spaces of deliberation, of shared decision-making, of opportunities for us to identify shared interests across difference, even with people who otherwise do not think like us and do not believe the same things as us, even in conflict. And we have to ask, what do we have in common with people who are different from us? We have to build solidarity first by asking this question and also creating spaces for this to happen. And schools and education centers, I really believe, can be laboratories for democracy. I think they already are, whether or not you think so. But they are places where students and learners are already enacting their democratic rights and their practices. So my last slide, and this is just a question and an open question to start us off. How do you support participation in the 21st century through your work in Erasmus+? And I would be glad to hear all of your inputs. Thank you very much.